Hey everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with our weekly update on social media. Thank you as always for joining us this week. A lot going on, both bad and good here in Washington, D.C. per usual. Judicial Watch, of course, on top of all of it. Major developments in the war on Trump by the left and the deep state. Steve Bannon, of course, also under the gun. I'll talk about developments there. And of course, Judicial Watch is standing strong for the rule of law with a new lawsuit about the Trump raid and new information about the COVID vaccines and how the government's been handling them, the internal deliberations, material that only Judicial Watch is able to obtain thanks to our Freedom of Information Act litigation. Plus some good news, at least in the states, as it relates to election integrity. I've got a good court development there to talk about as well. So first up is the continued abuse of President Trump, this time by the Pelosi Rump January 6th committee, which, as their committee is essentially going out of business, is pretty much assured that will happen, certainly if the Republicans take over in the House. They issued a subpoena. The subpoena was just issued a little bit before I'm talking to you now. And the subpoena requires Trump to produce records just a few days before the election, November 4th. The election is November 8th, and to testify on November 14th. So talk about an outrageous abuse of power. This is 18 months, what is it, more than 18 months after the so-called January 6th incident that they're all concerned about. And they decide to issue a subpoena 3 weeks before the election, not even 3 weeks before the election. And of course, election day is one thing. The election's already happening in many states. You're able to vote in many states already by mail or even in person, early voting in some states. And so this is a naked political abuse by the Pelosi gang, almost like the last gasp by the corrupt Pelosi Schiff operation. We saw this through the impeachments of Trump, and this is essentially impeachment 3.0. And now the question is Trump going to be is he going to be forced to testify before the committee is presumably shut down if Republicans win? I don't think that's likely, but who knows? The government may. Remember, Pelosi is working hand in glove with Garland to try to jail and harass their political enemies. And we're seeing that with Steve Bannon. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So who knows? Maybe President Trump will cite objections and they won't care and they'll seek to hold him in contempt and try to prosecute him. I mean, all bets are off when it comes to these abuses of Trump. But it just highlights how January 6th, however awful that some of those events were, has been misused and abused to target the First Amendment rights of those who are opposed to Biden, those who question the election in 2020, and pretty much anyone else who is seen as inconvenient to the ruling Democratic Party here in Washington, D.C., because it is partisan. Judicial Watch is a nonpartisan organization. We don't work for parties or oppose a party simply because they're Republican or simply because they're Democrat. But we have to be factual here. This is a Democratic Party-controlled operation. It's literally a one-party controlled operation in the House, this January 6th committee. And there's really been nothing like it in recent American history in terms of using the powers of Congress to grab the records of private citizens and then leak them and release them and otherwise harass them. I know Judicial Watch has been targeted. President Trump obviously has been targeted. I've been targeted. They were talking about emails I sent the White House last week or 2 weeks ago. And it's never going to end until it looks like they turn out the lights. And I don't know if they will turn out the lights, meaning maybe the Republicans won't win. And it will continue for the next 2 years as they try to keep their political opposition on their back heels as they go into the next presidential election season. So this is as much about the 2024 election, this subpoena, as it is about the 2020 election and the January 6th controversy. This is about harassing the putative opponent of the President Biden or whoever the Democrats nominate, because it's not clear, even to Democrats, that Biden's going to run again. So it's all politics, and I don't mean to suggest that it shouldn't be taken seriously as a result. It should be taken very seriously, because when you use the powers of government, essentially the use of force, right? Because you just can't say, oh, I don't want to deal with this. No, the law requires you to deal with it. The use of force, which the law relies on to enforce its way, requires you to deal with it, and requires recipients of subpoenas and those on the wrong end of a raid and such to let the government in. And the only way to object to it is to go to court. So they're abusing these precious resources in the judiciary to target Americans based on politics, not because there's a rule of law issue or Congress has a legitimate interest here. As I said before, there are significant separation of powers concerns about a president being called to testify before Congress, even if he is a former president. Now, the left media will pretend there's no significant separation of powers concerns. I don't know how the courts are going to handle it. So, as I've also noted and observed, the courts have been largely AWOL in protecting the president's prerogatives here. So we'll see what happens. But this is just, and you got to hand it to President Trump, because he continues to just keep on doing what President Trump does, despite all of these attacks, both which are largely illicit, using the law enforcement powers of the government, and in this case using the powers of Congress to attack his core civil liberties and his rights as a citizen in retaliation for his political activity. So when you think about this, is they're going after Trump because of what he represents and his political activity, and that's a violation of his First Amendment rights. So civil rights are at issue here. The president's civil rights are at issue, and other civil rights are at issue. And we see this abuse continue with Steve Bannon, who was prosecuted in virtually unprecedented fashion by the Biden Justice Department, who did it at the behest of Pelosi and gang in a dispute he had with the House January 6 Rump Committee over his testimony. He had serious concerns, and he was following his lawyer's advice about whether he should testify and whether there was an executive privilege issue and such. So it was the sort of back and forth that happens all the time between a committee and a witness. Certainly witnesses that have worked with the president, and despite what they tell you, executive privilege also applies to outside advisors. So Bannon talking to him even after he left the White House could be covered by executive privilege. So these issues are much more substantial than the government would like you to believe. And I don't say the government, I mean, I don't mean to say that this is a legitimate enterprise in my view, because as I said, these are political prosecutions. So, this is a significant constitutional fight, despite what the Biden Justice Department and the Pelosi gang say. Now, unfortunately for Biden, for Bannon, the Justice Department was willing to try to put him in jail, and they put him on trial, and a jury here in D.C. And yes, juries in D.C. tend to be left-wing and Democrat, because that's just the nature of the population here. They're left-wing and Democrats by overwhelming numbers here. They convicted him, and he was sentenced to 4 months in jail at the hearing. The sentencing hearing this week just happened, again, just before I'm going on air here. So now Bannon's going to appeal this. Now, are you aware of anyone else being found in contempt of Congress recently and being prosecuted by the Justice Department? Eric Holder, who was found in contempt for lying to Congress and hiding records about lying to Congress over his agency's involvement in knowingly sending guns to the drug cartels. It looks to me in the hopes that they would be used in gun crimes to further justify Second Amendment restrictions here in the United States. And one of the guns showed up at the scene of Ryan Terry, who was a Border Patrol agent who was killed in a gun battle. And Holder's Justice Department has admitted that these guns would continue to be used and have been used and be responsible for, they're already been tied to hundreds of deaths, and they continue to be used forever until they no longer function. And Holder was held in contempt. And of course, the Obama Justice Department refused to prosecute him. The Attorney General of the United States was held in contempt of Congress, and the same crowd essentially running the Justice Department today refused to move against him because he was one of them, a Democrat leftist who was helping Obama. So this is the double standard here in Washington, D.C., and I joke, I say it's not really a double standard, it's perfectly consistent, which is to prosecute people they don't like because of their politics, Republicans/conservatives, and protect fellow leftists and Democrats. And that's the challenge that we face when it comes to reining in the Justice Department, because they can't be trusted to play it straight. I mean, you understand politics impacts a little bit of what the Justice Department does, and I don't want to, it's the reality of the system of government we have. The Justice Department's responsive to politics because it's run by an elected official and appointed officials who are subject to being approved by other politicians over in the Senate. But to have these core law enforcement powers obviously just being used to target your political opponents, that's third world. That's not only un-American, as I highlight, it's anti-American. It goes against our constitutional system and, frankly, everything we believe as Americans, everything we believe America isn't, is what this Justice Department is doing. So they're trying to put an effective voice against the January 6th committee. I mean, when you look at what they're going after with Bannon, and I've noticed this also with some of these January 6th defendants, they highlight completely legitimate First Amendment protected speech as a reason to enhance their sentencing for other crimes. So if you criticize the January 6th committee, or you have concerns about the election, they use that as an excuse to try to increase your jail sentence. Does that sound fair or right to you? Of course not. So we'll see what happens with Bannon. And in the meantime, while they're trying to jail and harass people who supposedly aren't cooperating with the January 6th committee, and I'll say it once, and I'll say it again, Nancy Pelosi's Congress is hiding every minute of the 14,000 hours of video from the January 6th disturbance. They're hiding. We know that the police, the Capitol Hill Police, the board, it looks like there are at least 270 emails that they don't want to turn over to Judicial Watch. And they're citing, because we sued in court under this theory that the public has a right to know what the government's up to. Common law right to know. Common law right of public access to government documents. And they're saying, oh no, you can't sue us. We have sovereign immunity. And even if you could sue us, these records aren't important enough for the public to gain access to them. So that's the hypocrisy of the January 6th operation. You have this Pelosi Congress trying to jail people who, quote, aren't providing information to Congress about January 6th by objecting legitimately under executive privilege and other privileges, while hiding records and going to federal court to fight to hide records about what happened that day. So it's essentially saying that, oh, Nancy Pelosi is immune from testimony. Oh, Congress doesn't have to turn over any emails. We don't care what Congress has done. When in fact, what happened on that day is as much a failure as Nancy Pelosi's, and frankly, Mitch McConnell, who was also partly responsible for security there, as it is anyone else. Because they're responsible for security at the Capitol, and the Capitol had lacked security, despite all sorts of warnings that there would be immense crowds that even if they didn't know they were going to be violent, required just a bigger police and potentially National Guard presence. So you know why they're hiding that, because my guess is those records are going to show something that is politically unhelpful to them. And it highlights the corruption of what they're doing, which is trying to jail others for asserting their rights as citizens while hiding records from citizens about the issues they're pretending to be caring about, which is January 6th. So what I love about what Judicial Watch is doing is that all this abuse isn't just something we go on and complain about. As I said, we've got a lawsuit now in federal court against Nancy Pelosi's Congress for the January 6th videos, those 14,000 hours of videos. With the abuse of Trump on this raid on his home, we have lawsuit after lawsuit for records about that raid. We've sued for we sued the Justice Department / FBI. Did you talk to the Biden White House about the raid? Give us the records. They don't want to give us the records. So we're in federal court. The National Archives, which pretends to be concerned about making sure the public has access to government documents, is hiding records. As I highlighted, 99% of the records they said they found about this issue, they're hiding from the American people. And Judicial Watch right now is litigating, and we'll be litigating that issue in court. And we just sued the Secret Service for records about the Trump raid as well. So that's lawsuit number 4, I think, on this specific case. We had sued the Secret Service because evidently, or the reports are, that the Secret Service essentially facilitated the entry of the Lord knows how many FBI agents who went in there and vacuumed up hundreds of thousands of pages of documents from Trump's home in an unprecedented abusive fashion, using a warrant that was out of control. And the Secret Service has refused to give us the records. We sued here in the District of Columbia, so that's typically where we sue. It's where the government is, so you tend to sue where the government is, and of course that's where Judicial Watch is as well. We asked for all emails and text messages sent to and from officials on President Trump's protective detail regarding the search warrant and or execution of the search warrant on his residence on August 8th. And all video and audio recordings capturing the execution of the search warrant on President Trump's home on August 8th. Now, they did get our requests, we know that. If I recall from the lawsuit, they said they'll respond to us, and they haven't. So what did they find that they don't want to turn over? That's why we're suing in court. The FBI reportedly notified the Secret Service a few hours before the raid that it would happen, and that Secret Service agents facilitated access, as I said, to Trump's home. So, what is the Secret Service, as I say in our release, trying to hide about its involvement in the Biden FBI's unprecedented and abusive raid of Trump's home? And by the way, Justice Department attorneys, if I recall, were there as well. This FOIA lawsuit, which is, as I said, is the 4th filed on this incident, further highlights the Biden administration's comprehensive cover-up about its latest abuses of the former president. So again, this is a raid that Attorney General Garland himself has admitted the public has a significant interest in transparency on. Yet his agencies, the Justice Department, the FBI, are hiding records. The Secret Service, which is a sub-agency of the Department for Homeland Security, is hiding records, and the National Archives are hiding records. So essentially 3 or 4 agencies of the Biden administration are hiding records about this raid. And we're not asking for records about like someone's social security number on the Secret Service or someone's unrelated emails in the FBI. We want records about this raid. How many records could there possibly be? Not that many. And yet they're very nervous about turning them over to us. So nervous that they're willing to violate federal FOIA law to hide them. Are we going to raid the Secret Service? Is the FBI going to raid the Secret Service for hiding these records from Judicial Watch? Of course, that never happens, right? But they raided Trump's home. So talk about double standards. You've got the FBI and the Justice Department hiding records in violation of law. No one raids them. You got the archives hiding records. Nope, no one raids them. They work with the FBI to raid, to try to prosecute Trump. So more is coming. And as I said, we're in the forefront of this battle for transparency on this abusive use of force by the Biden operation against President Trump. Immediately after the raid happened, we went to the court. The magistrate who signed the raid down in Florida asked that he unseal the warrant. The warrant was unsealed as a result of Judicial Watch's litigation. We're asking for records now about what happened. And of course, we've been front and center to the chagrin of the Justice Department and the Biden media in educating the American people about what Judicial Watch had gone through in trying to get similar records from Bill Clinton. The Bill Clinton sock drawer case, where a reporter had recorded Bill Clinton during his presidency being present, talking to foreign leaders. And he had these tapes that were presumptively classified. When you talk to, the president's communication with foreign leaders are presumptively classified. And we thought, well, he still had them. Why can't we get them under the Presidential Records Act? Presidential Records Act, that means in the theory that we had pushed, that they're presidential records and the president still has them, go get them so we can get them under the Presidential Records Act, because eventually the American people have a right of access to these records. And they came back to us and said, no, they're his, they're personal. That's what the Justice Department told the court. They're personal, they're presumptively personal. And what's ironic is, the media likes to pretend that case doesn't exist, or if they do, they try to distinguish it. And they really can't. And ironically, the Justice Department finally admitted the case exists, and they said the court opined that that the president has the right to select what are personal versus presidential records, which is kind of the core issue here, isn't it? And they said, but no one's figured out what to do after the president leaves office. Well, what difference does it make? You can't second guess a decision, and when he's the president, he classifies them as personal. That's what the court said. And then he takes them with him. They're personal. He can take them with him. And if he does take them with him, they're necessarily personal. There's no second guessing the president under the law. Or at least that's what we were told, but I guess the rules have changed for Trump. So we're investigating the corruption around this raid. We're educating about the law around this raid. And we're not going to be intimidated by anyone from telling the truth. Now, I know it's election season, and there's always these fights, or there have been these fights recently, especially around 2020, over changes to the way elections are conducted, increasing the opportunities to vote by mail, same-day voter registration, which is another big, in my view, dangerous idea from the left, which means that you just show up and register on the day you vote, which obviously invites fraud, which is why it's typically frowned upon. And in Delaware, there was a change to the law that increased vote by mail opportunities and imposed the same day registration. And we had filed an amicus brief highlighting how those changes to the law were in violation of Delaware's Constitution. And the Delaware Supreme Court struck down the law, essentially agreeing with our amicus brief that the mailing voting statute impermissibly expanded or changed voting laws contrary to the plain language of the Constitution. So the decision, which came down recently, came in a case in which the court was considering the constitutionality of two state laws passed by the Delaware General Assembly that attempted to grant every voter the opportunity to vote by mail and to register to vote up to the day of the general election. So as I say, the court essentially ruled that the changes expanding absentee voters and expanding in a dramatic way the voter registration opportunities went against the relevant provisions of the Delaware Constitution. Now, this is what Judicial Watch emphasized in our amicus brief. We said that mail-in voting is highly susceptible to fraud and abuse, and told the court that the statute in question is unconstitutional and should be struck down. State and federal officials have universally acknowledged, we wrote, the existence of the threat of fraud due to mail-in voting. Voting by mail is problematic enough that election experts say there have been multiple elections in which no one can say with confidence which candidate was the deserved winner. The Delaware Constitution and precedent allow absentee and mail-in voting in only the following instances: when in public service to the United States or the state of Delaware, due to illness or disability, by reason of absence while on vacation, due to religious tenets or teachings, and due to emergency declaration by the General Assembly in response to an ongoing pandemic. Without amending the Delaware Constitution, any legislative act by the General Assembly to expand absentee voting beyond these requirements is per se invalid. So did you notice what we highlighted as being the law already under the Constitution in Delaware? You essentially can vote for any reason you can come up with. You say you're sick, you say you're on vacation, and you want to vote by mail. So you already have, in my view, already a too broad an opportunity to vote by mail. And so what the Delaware General Assembly did in a partisan way was to essentially provide vote by mail to anyone who wanted it for any reason anyway, any reason or no reason. So that just changes the whole election on its head in a way that contradicted the plain language of the Delaware Constitution. And so what's important about this is the left doesn't seem to think that the rules apply. That you can change the Delaware Constitution. It is possible, but they didn't want to bother, right? Why follow the rules? Well, just do it. And that's not the way it's supposed to work in a Republican form of government. The Delaware Supreme Court's ruling makes it harder to unlawfully tamper with an election. And Judicial Watch is gratified the court agreed with our amicus brief and acted swiftly to strike down these unconstitutional election laws that created increased opportunities for fraud in the November 8th elections. So I can highlight Supreme Court decisions, and basically I don't need to tell you how to follow your own common sense, that when you have people voting away from the polls, there's really no check, or it's much less of a check to ensure that the vote is done in a legitimate way or without coercion. I mean, that's the reality of it. And the left has decided they don't want people, or they're less interested in having people show up at the polls. And I think that's a terrible policy, and I think it ought to end. And if I were running things, I would severely limit the opportunity to vote by mail. I mean, unless you're getting your head blown off for our country abroad in the military or some other emergency situation, you should vote in person. That's the way it's done in many parts of the world without controversy. And if you want to put a polling place in an area that people who are elderly are more able to get to it, so there's no question, no help, there's no issues there, that's fine. But people should vote in person with an ID after confirming their citizenship status to even register to vote. Those should be the rules. And the fact that simple ideas like that are so vociferously opposed by the left, I think should tell you something. And so Judicial Watch right now is in court trying to clean up rolls in New York and in Pennsylvania and in Colorado. We're in Illinois trying to fight a law that counts ballots up to 14 days after an election. I think including undated ballots that arrive after Election Day. I mean, how does that comport with election integrity or the law? So we'll see what happens there. And of course, we're prepping for the elections as well. And I encourage you, if you're aware of election fraud, or voter fraud, contact us. We've got this ad out. You can't see it, but I'm going to read it to you. Help keep our elections honest. Maybe we can put it up on our video here as I'm reading it. A Judicial Watch Election Fraud Report Line. If you witness any suspicious activity at your polling place, have issues with your voting machine, or witness voter fraud or intimidation, alert your local polling station election officials. So do that quickly and respectfully. Call your state's election hotline. You can locate your state's election hotline number by searching online for Elections Hotline, name of your state. So if you live in Connecticut, Connecticut Elections Hotline. Send a detailed email to our election law attorneys, Judicial Watch's election law attorneys, at electionlaw@judicialwatch.org, electionlaw@judicialwatch.org. That's the email address. In your email, please describe anything strange, unusual, bizarre, suspicious, frightening, irritating, or otherwise worth noting which you witnessed. Tell us the time and location where the incident occurred. Let us know if the polling place election officials were aware of this incident, and if so, what steps were taken in response. Please include your name and phone number so our election law attorneys can get in touch with you if needed. And never, ever, ever get into a confrontation with another voter. This isn't about yelling at your fellow citizens in the polling place, folks. If there's an issue, you talk to the folks who are running the show. You avoid confronting other voters. It should never happen. Stay calm. Again, talk to the election officials and then tell us about it. So talk to the election officials. Don't say, I'm just going to tell Judicial Watch. No, tell the folks you're supposed to talk to first in the government. As I say, respectfully. Don't mess with other voters. Don't confront other voters. If you think another voter is cheating, talk to an official. Don't talk to the voter. So this is a way to help keep your elections honest. And Judicial Watch, if we find anything substantial as a result of your communications, obviously we'll follow up. And so, as always, Judicial Watch will be your watchdog, not only here in Washington, but throughout the states when it comes to election integrity. So also in the news this week is the development that an advisory group for, the FDA recommended putting these COVID vaccines and boosters on the schedule of approved vaccinations for children. Now, as you might imagine, it's caused great consternation and controversy. The concern is by putting those controversial treatments on the approved vaccine schedule, it will make it easier for states and localities to require vaccinations of children. It doesn't guarantee that the mandates will occur, but it makes it easier for the mandates to occur. And not only that, makes it potentially legally more difficult to challenge such mandates because of the blessing that the corrupt FDA has given to this controversial COVID vaccine program and treatment protocol. Now, Judicial Watch, again, has been a key leader in investigating the COVID scandals, where the COVID disease came from, the lies and misdeeds about by Fauci as it relates to China and COVID and all of that. We've investigated gain-of-function research, exposed pretty much everything what you know about gain-of-function research. We proved that Fauci was lying, it looks like, about gain-of-function research. So that's pretty clear. We've also gone to town in asking for and suing for records as it relates to the development of the vaccines. And we keep on getting documents, so many documents, they may seem overwhelming in number, but I encourage you to look at them because if we didn't have them, you wouldn't know about it. I mean, these vaccines are the most important drug developed in arguably the history of the modern world. And yet we have to sue to get basic information about how they came to be and how they were evaluated. We have two lawsuits that have just extracted more documents from the government. We had a lawsuit against the FDA for records of these two individuals who essentially left the FDA because the FDA was moving to approve boosters despite these individuals not thinking they were really needed, or put on a timeline that they thought was more of a political timeline than a public health related timeline. So that's the way these vaccines have been approved. There's been all these political back and forth. We've proven it with these documents. Now we have these new documents that show in this lawsuit that we just received, we received 43 pages of heavily redacted records regarding the COVID vaccine. So we sued under the Freedom of Information Act for records of the communications from the former director and deputy director of the FDA's Office of Vaccines Research and Review, Dr. Marion Gruber and Dr. Philip Krause. They were, again, among a group of resigning doctors who agreed that available evidence, this is a quote, doesn't yet indicate a need for COVID-19 vaccine booster shots among the general population. And that was from September of 2021, all the way back in September 2021. In July of 2021, there was an email that we uncovered as a result of this lawsuit to an individual whose name is redacted, so we don't know who it was sent to. So what's interesting is we asked about these specific doctors and got additional emails as it relates to this really intense pressure campaign to get these boosters out there. There's a July 2021 email, where they were talking about folks and warning people about using these boosters in essentially an experimental fashion. It's under this investigational new drug exemption, which folks were looking for the ability to use these boosters. And one of them said, in kind of setting up a description of how to deal with this, vaccines which are available under the Emergency Use Authorization may be considered lawfully marketed if used under the scope of authorization as described in the letter of authorization for each product. Now this is the key part. Note that an important consideration is the possible risk to subjects, so please clearly identify the intended study population and include a discussion of the issue from your perspective. So what was going on is that folks were pressing to use these boosters, and they were pressing the FDA for special permissions, and this was like, you got to be careful here, right? So what's interesting here, there's this other set of emails from, it looks like a medical entity that had patients that had already been vaccinated that were immunocompromised, and they wanted permission to, quote, conduct a study to give them the booster. And the FDA was under the gun here because they really didn't have a good feel for what was going on with this study. And if you want to, and this is kind of the smoker or the kicker in the email, and you can look at it's only 45 pages, so download it and look at it. So someone writes, we currently have a few immune-compromised patients in our ICU who are fully vaccinated. It is difficult to remain patient when we are on the front lines observing this happen. We'd like to initiate a third dose boost as soon as possible on our most vulnerable patients. Is there any way to expedite this request? So someone says, well, can't we just get a verbal okay from so-and-so? And that's in response to someone who wrote, Mr. Krause, who we talked about here, he wrote, but it doesn't sound like they actually want to do a study. They just wanted to vaccinate these people, if I'm reading this correctly. I mean, isn't that crazy town? That's what the FDA was dealing with. And it's not clear what happened here, but this booster thing is a disaster in terms of confidence, public confidence, in how it's been handled. And I know there's all this controversy about potential mass vaccination of children for these COVID shots. But when you see how they handled it for adults, you're going to see where this controversy came from. So similarly, we have new records from HHS on that shows senior CDC officials were discussing myocarditis in adolescents following the COVID vaccine. Well, isn't that nice to know? Again, we had sued for records under the Freedom of Information Act when they refused to when the FDA refused to respond to a request for all emails sent to and from members of the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee regarding adverse events, deaths, and other injuries caused by investigatory vaccines for the prevention or treatment of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 currently produced by Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson. The Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee is the U.S. government's central advisory body, along with the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and that's the body that just voted to advise the FDA to put the COVID vaccines on the children's schedule of vaccines. They're the ones charged with advising on COVID vaccines. May 13th, 2021, Senior CDC Director, Division of Birth Defects and Infant Disorders, Dr. Amanda Cohen, wrote to FDA Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, Dr. Peter Marks, and other officials about COVID-19 vaccines. I have another issue to discuss as well, reports of myocarditis in adolescents. I'm putting together an email, but this may come to the surface this weekend. This was back in May of last year, by the way. And we're now just getting this. So they were talking about the myocarditis issue in adolescents in May of last year. And now we're seeing more and more reports and controversies about myocarditis. Now, whenever you say, oh, there's been these links to the vaccine or these adverse reports, the left comes in and they pretend to fact check you. In fact, they're trying to suppress you by saying, well, there's no tie specifically to the vaccine. There's no causal relationship. Just because someone gets the vaccine and they fall down, it doesn't mean they fell down because of the vaccine. Well, that's true. It doesn't mean they didn't fall down because of the vaccine too, but they don't want to talk about that. So it's been pretty well established, my understanding is, and I encourage you to check it out, that there is a myocarditis relationship to the vaccines, that there's a potential increased risk of myocarditis, especially for younger males. Now, there's a debate whether or not that means you should take or not take the vaccine or whether it should be used widely. I'm not going to get into that. But that's the reality, and people deserve to know everything there is out there about this incredible new drug. And I don't use incredible in a good sense of the word. It's incredible in the sense that it's the most massive drug push in world history, this vaccine operation. We talked about the propaganda campaign behind it. And it's little old Judicial Watch that's getting some of this basic data. In a section of the FDA briefing document submitted by Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, which is which is a partner with Johnson & Johnson on that vaccine, to the FDA regarding trials of the COVID vaccine, they noted that 5 people experienced serious adverse events, selected events among vaccine recipients for which a contributory effect of the vaccine could not be excluded based on FDA assessment of the clinical information provided. These adverse events included deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, transverse sinus thrombosis, seizure, and hemiparesis, which is an inability to move on one side of the body, occurring anywhere from 3 to 28 days following the vaccination. In a section of the same briefing document titled Pregnancies, the briefing document notes that of 4 women who became pregnant following the Janssen shot, 2 of the babies were lost, one due to an ectopic pregnancy and the other due to spontaneous abortion. In a section of the document titled Safety Summary, the study states, numerical imbalances were reported between vaccine and placebo recipients for thromboembolic events, 15 versus 10, and tinnitus, 6 versus 0. So it beggars belief that the Biden administration tried to hide these key documents that would serve to inform the public about the safety of the COVID vaccines. Because, I read these to you, and this is, by the way, 1,000 pages of documents we uncovered. So I'm just giving you a taste of the documents that you can go on and look at directly yourself, which I'm sure the left is furious about. And the public health regime that's trying to suppress this information is furious about. I mean, we sent this request for this information in August of last year, and we're just getting it. Talking about myocarditis, talking about these pregnancy issues and descriptions, and that we had to wait so long for information on these, what I would understand to be blood clot events. So, am I saying these documents prove you shouldn't take the vaccine or that the vaccine should be removed? No, but I'm saying this is information to have for that debate. And why are they hiding it? Because they think it wouldn't be helpful for the debate. They've said that previously about other information they withheld. They were hiding information, and I'm going on memory here, but there was significant information they refused to put out because they thought it would help or would increase vaccine hesitancy. So politics. They were hiding it for political reasons. So again, it was a federal lawsuit that Judicial Watch had to pursue to get these 1,000 pages of documents that show they were talking about all these issues that people are very much interested in. It's a big debate about pregnancy. It's a big debate about myocarditis. It's a big debate about blood clots and these vaccines. And these are just the debates about adverse events. I won't get into the issues about efficacy and the craziness around that. I mean, what's frustrating about this, even as I talk about this, and even as I try to be factual, I know Facebook and YouTube are going to place labels on this video. And trust me, look below this video if you're looking at it on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. Look at below. And it will have something about COVID-19. So they're vandalizing our content with this misleading vandalization below, suggesting that, oh, if you want the truth, go somewhere else. So the propaganda effort continues, the suppression continues. We get documents from the government, I fairly explain them, put them in context, and they're still labeling this video. Limiting your ability. They're trying to scare you from sharing it. Click and share this on Facebook if you're watching this. See what happens. They're going to say, do you want to share this? Because it has something about COVID in it. So I don't know about you, but I'm tired of the censorship. I'm tired of being told we're not allowed to talk about what the government's up to with respect to this public health debate. And I'm tired of big tech pretending that they're doing it to advance the public health when in fact they're just doing it to help the Biden administration at this point, who needs all the help they can get for the reasons that are, I would think, are rather obvious to you. So Judicial Watch is not going to stop. We're going to continue to investigate the COVID vaccines, Dr. Fauci. We're going to investigate the origins of COVID, gain-of-function research, not only in China, but here at home. I mean, there was news about Boston University engaged in some type of gain-of-function research, as best as I understood it, in a way that I thought was egregious and dangerous. So even after all the debate, it's still potentially going on. And so Judicial Watch will continue to lead the fight to expose the full truth about everything COVID. And we do that with your support. And this is, again, why I love Judicial Watch. We are pushing on so many important issues: election integrity, the war on the First Amendment, the abuse of Trump, the abuse of opponents of President Biden, the deep state abuses, the abuses by the FBI and DOJ, January 6th, making sure elections are clean. And again, we're not talking about this just for the sake of talking about it. We're in court trying to get the information, trying to get accountability, informing you, the American people, about what your government is up to. And if you're not supporting Judicial Watch, I encourage you to support our work. Go to judicialwatch.org. judicialwatchoneword.org. Read all these documents. Share it. That's one way to support our work, and obviously another way to support our work is to make a donation directly, and I encourage you to do that as well. We can't do any of this without your support. Thank you, and I wish you the best, and I'll see you here next time on the Judicial Watch Weekly Update. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.